recent Rogers outage has brought to light our reliance on our internet service providers, the monopoly on those service providers, and I don't know why this keeps coming up, but our government's lack of responsibility, this time towards healthy competition in our markets. We've been working from home a lot these past few years, and this outage has proven that that is unsustainable. If we're going to continue working from home to the same extent, or even more so, then there has to be greater diversity among our internet service providers. This would minimize the amount of people affected when there is an outage, and it would minimize the disruptions to production when that happens. For example, I couldn't send files to the podcast team during the outage. If I'd been here, then that wouldn't have been a problem. So maybe we should all just go back to working in person. I like that idea. But if not, then there has to be greater variety in our market. Additionally, our financial services were tied up during the outage. Interac was completely down, and that's because it relies entirely on Rogers. So you couldn't take cash out of the bank, you couldn't pay by debit. Credit was your only option unless you already had cash on hand. And this really hurt our small businesses. As the head of a small business association said, many of those transactions are ordinarily at small businesses, which rely on Interac as a relatively low-cost payment system. Having Interac sales, and in many cases online ordering, disrupted by the Rogers outage was the last thing those businesses needed after suffering through 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dan Kelly, president and CEO of the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, said some businesses were likely out thousands of dollars in sales on the day because of the outage. This just goes to show that Interac is a monopoly. It's the largest debit provider. Take a look at the credit providers. There's Discover, MasterCard, Visa, JCB, UnionPay, American Express. Wow, I'm impressed that I can remember that list. Anyways, with all the variety among those credit providers, there is variety among their internet service providers. And so credit was not impacted the same way that debit was with this outage. Thankfully, Interac spokesperson Brian Bosson told the Toronto Star that the company would be adding another service provider. Fantastic! They really should have thought of that a lot sooner. Anyways, speaking of monopolies, Rogers is buying Shaw. Now, the governing system in Canada is really confusing and the average Canadian does not understand how it works, so I'm going to break it down for you as best as I can. In this case, we have 2 agencies appointed by our government and 1 ministry that are involved with the Rogers and Shaw merger. The first agency is the CRTC, which stands for Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, and it regulates TV, internet, and phone services. The next agency is the CCB, the Canadian Competition Bureau, which is responsible for keeping an eye on competition in our markets and for preventing monopolies. And then the ministry is the ISED, the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, which works to promote a fair, efficient, and competitive marketplace. So how are all of these organizations involved in the Rogers and Shaw merger? Let's take a look at this timeline of key events in the Rogers and Shaw deal. The shareholders approved the deal. Bell urges the CRTC to reject the merger, but a few months later they approve it. The ministry wants to block Rogers' purchase of Shaw because they don't want Rogers acquiring the wireless services. Then the Competition Bureau files an application to block Rogers' purchase of Shaw because it claims the transaction would lead to worse service and higher prices for consumers. However, it's not likely for the Competition Bureau to succeed in this case because they don't have a good track record in situations like this. Then Rogers and Shaw come up with a plan to appease the Competition Bureau's concerns, which is to sell Freedom Mobile, Shaw's wireless network operator, to Quebecor, a smaller internet provider specific to Quebec. Instead, this pleases the ministry because that was the only issue that they had with this merger. And if this merger goes through, then Rogers will not only have a monopoly on the telecommunications sector, but also in the broadcasting market. While it looks like our government is involved in this deal, it's not really doing its job in ensuring healthy competition in our markets. Our government loves deferring responsibility to these agencies, boards, and commissions, the ABCs, because then that way nothing is the ministry's fault. And then they can do what they always do and launch an investigation into something in order to please the people. But in this case, they've launched an investigation into the outage instead of into the merger. There are hundreds of these agencies doing the work for our government. They operate at arm's length and they are very often corrupt. These are taxpayer dollars. This is our money that is paying for these agencies to not do their job while we have ministries that should be working on these issues. What we want is not for the government to be controlling people, but to be regulating what the people can't control. And in this case, that's the competition in our markets. So we think that our government should dissolve these failed agencies, take responsibility for what should already be their responsibility, so that ministries like the ISED can actually get involved and do the work themselves. And in this case, That means blocking the Rogers and Shaw merger. There will be more to this unresolved story, so make sure to like, share, and subscribe and hit that notification button so that you don't miss any more of our adventures into government workings. And make sure to leave your comments below.